5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Growing out of the post-World War II tensions amongst the United States and Soviet Union, the Cold War arose as a rivalry between the two nations. As a result of the severed ties between the United States and Soviet Union at the Yalta Conference, the seeds of the Cold War were planted. For much of the second half of the 20th century, there were mutual suspicions, heightened tensions, and a series of international incidents. The Grand Alliance would be no more, and the US and Soviet Union would return to sharing the mutual hatred and being the bitter enemies that they were before World War II. Collectively, these events brought the world's superpowers to the brink of disaster.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Beginning with Harry S. Truman, he was born in Lamar, Missouri on May 8, 1884.
Truman Doctrine. In March of 1947, President Truman asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid in order to help anti-communist governments in Greece and Turkey. The Soviet Union seeked the control of Dardanelles in Turkey, and Truman also wanted to halt the communist rebellion in Greece. Along with Kennan's Article X, the Truman Doctrine was known for being one of the cornerstones of Truman's Cold War policy of containment.
In December of 1947, Truman suggested a European recovery program that would provide $17 billion in aid to Western European countries. During its 4-year lifespan, it would become known as the Marshall Plan. The influx of US currency in Western Europe not only led to the self-sustaining growth abroad, but it invigorated the economy in the United States. Although the communist threats remained in the region, communist influence upon Western European countries had less of an impact over the years.
The Soviet Union had plans to control Western Germany and with it, Berlin as well. Truman was in no state to appease the Soviet Union with Berlin, knowing that a similar approach did not work with Germany during World War II. As a result of the airlift, the people of West Berlin received US supplies and Stalin would not challenge action. The Berlin airlift showed that the United States would not back down and not fall to communism.
Nearing the end of Truman's presidency, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established under his command. The military alliance would encompass the United States, Canada, and 10 European nations. NATO acted in defense of the nations, providing them with unity against communist nations. In 1955, the Soviet Union responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, which coalesced the force of the communist countries of Eastern Europe.
On October 14, 1890, Dwight D Eisenhower, frequently known as Little Ike, was born in Denison, Texas.
Eisenhower became an esteemed soldier during World War I and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. During World War II, he quickly ascended up the ladder and was literally jumping from one position to the next. Eisenhower had major victories in Africa, Sicily, and other parts of Italy. Nonetheless, his most remarkable accomplishment was the invasion of Europe. Eisenhower was the commander of the D-Day operation and successfully vanquished the Axis forces. He became the general of the army in the final days of the war and helped with demobilization following the war. After the war, he became the president of Columbia University.
The Atoms for Peace plan was presented by Eisenhower in front of the United Nations. It acted as a means of compromising and negotiating with the Soviet Union amidst the start of the Cold War. Eisenhower's main goal was to create a mutual peace between both nations and to open their skies to each other. While this failed to reach a compromise between the two nations, this beckoned a positive sign for the US. The Eisenhower Doctrine was established by Dwight D Eisenhower in order to justify sending troops to a rising Middle Eastern nation. The rising threat of communism led to the establishment of this document. This was because the United States needed to support third world developing countries from falling to communism. The doctrine was very successful and became the exemplar of its involvement in foreign nations. The United States was able to use this doctrine on numerous occasions and help contain the threat of communism.
The U-2 incident was also a very important event during the Cold War, as this put the United States and Soviet relations to a stalemate. A U-2 American spy plane, which is monitoring and taking pictures of Soviet territory, was shot down in Soviet territory.
The U-2 incident influenced Khrushchev to back out of the Paris conference, which was supposed to take place in a couple of weeks.
Eisenhower was forced to take responsibility for this incident, as the pilot of the plane revealed the US government's plan on public television. This would be one of the low points in American and Soviet Union relations. Truman and Eisenhower were both legendary Cold Warriors, and each have their respective accomplishments and shortcomings. Truman successfully ended World War II by using nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, he also killed millions of civilians due to the impending threat of the Japanese government. Following this, he participated in NATO and issued the Marshall Plan in order to suppress the proliferation of communism. Eisenhower is truly a strong and noble soldier, and also had a handful of accomplishments during his presidency. He created the Eisenhower Doctrine, oversaw the U-2 incident, and proposed the Atoms of Peace plan. Lastly, both men oversaw the Korean War, but Eisenhower officially ended the war in Korea. While both men truly had a great impact in the Cold War, Eisenhower was a better Cold Warrior. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, from a reputable and wealthy family of politicians, businessmen, and tradesmen.
He did not receive the Democratic nomination until 1960. Due to televised debates, JFK was able to swiftly defeat his opponent Richard Nixon in 1960, thus ascending him to the presidency.
The Peace Corps and Alliance for Progress was similar to the Marshall Plan. However, it was established in order to prevent communism from arising in Latin America. The threat of communism was quite grave, as the Soviet Union was now a dominant force in the Eastern Hemisphere. Military intervention was also a key aspect of this alliance between the United States and Latin American nations. While the United States did not accomplish their goal, this was a very important event in Kennedy's presidency.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the precipice of JFK's presidency, as the entire world was on the brink of nuclear warfare. The Cubans obtained nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union after a failed attempt by the United States to overthrow the Cuban government. A U-2 spy plane helped the US government locate these weapons of mass destruction, and forced Kennedy to send a letter to Khrushchev. Kennedy issued a blockade of Cuba, as these nuclear weapons could reach the United States in merely minutes. Eventually, Khrushchev decided on disarming and removing these weapons from Cuba, as the United States claimed that they would be dismantling their nuclear weapons from a base in Turkey.
The Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was the last significant event during Kennedy's presidency. This treaty was signed between the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty prohibited these nations from testing nuclear weapons above ground. The radiation from these weapons is extremely lethal, and restricting these weapons would prevent the spread of radiation. Nikita Khrushchev was born on April 15, 1894, in a small town near the modern-day Ukraine and Russia border.
During World War II, Khrushchev helped organize troops into Germany through Ukraine, a newly conquered territory.
When Stalin died in 1953, Georgy Malenkov became the premier, while Khrushchev became the head of the Communist Party in the country.
At the 20th Communist Party conference in 1956, Khrushchev made his famous secret speech in which he spoke out against Stalin and his practices for 6 hours. This sparked de-Stalinization, and the government made all attempts to efface any physical remnant of Stalin.
The Warsaw Pact was initiated in response to NATO. It called for the creation of an alliance between the East European communist nations. Originally, the pact was composed of the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania.
The Hungarian Revolt was an uprising by the Hungarians, who were tired of being controlled by the Soviet Union. This was a failed attempt by the Hungarians to escape from the control of the Soviet Union. However, they did not have sufficient power, training, or coordination, nor did they have the support of the United States. The United States did not do anything, as Eisenhower did not want to start a war in Europe.
Also, the space age was an important part of Khrushchev's tenure as leader of the communist government. Under Khrushchev, the Russians were able to send the first satellite into outer space. The launch of Sputnik was a precursor of the space age. It influenced the United States to create NASA and increase their funding for education. The creation of these machines beckoned a new period for the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Kennedy and Khrushchev seemed to be polar opposites in terms of personalities, yet both of them sought to make a political difference in the Cold War. Next to Truman and Eisenhower, JFK was one of the most important American Cold Warriors. On the other hand, Kennedy had to deal with much of Khrushchev's foreign policy during the 1960s. JFK took an active role in preventing the spread of communism through the creation of many peace organizations. Khrushchev was a firm believer in communism, but he toned down the cruelty within the Soviet Union. But there was one main difference between Khrushchev and Kennedy. Kennedy was able to conduct more bold moves with poise, while Khrushchev faltered in tough times. This is most apparent during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev's eventual withdrawal of the missiles sparked a widespread criticism in the USSR and China.
On December 26, 1893, Mao Zedong was born to a peasant family in the province of Hunan, China. He was a part of the Xinhai Geming, or Xinhai Revolution, that overthrew the emperor and eventually became a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921.
As an adopter of Leninist ideals and principle, he quickly rose through the ranks in the party, eventually reaching the position of executive to the Shanghai branch of the Communist Party. Mao and the surviving communists reorganized in Jiangxi province. In 1934, Mao led them on a long march, a 6,000-mile journey north after Chiang led KMT forces south and surrounded them. In 1949, civil war broke out between the nationalists and communists, where Mao and the communists won. Chiang fled to Taiwan, and Mao declared the formation of the Republic of China.
The 100 Flower Campaign was a campaign started in 1956 in which Mao encouraged the citizens to express criticisms and opinions toward the existing communist regime. Mao saw this as a chance to promote socialism in hoping that many people's opinions would downplay capitalism. Many leading academics, intellectuals, and college students began to speak out against the government, and between May and June of that year, the government offices received millions of letters. Mao dismissed many of the criticisms and stopped the campaign in 1957, and he used this as a chance to start the anti-rightist movement, where he identified between 300 and 500,000 people as rightists who were persecuted.
As a follow-up from the first 5-year plan, the Great Leap Forward was Mao's economic plan to leap and surpass the Soviets in demonstrating their economic superiority over them. The two main aspects of the Great Leap Forward were steel production to surpass England and the creation of communes. Because most of the people were employed for steel production, communes of farmers fell behind in agricultural production. The economy went out of control due to deallocation of the workforce. Natural disaster struck in 1959 to 1961, causing the death of 30 to 40 million people. Despite all this, Mao still proclaimed the Great Leap Forward as a success.
Mao attempted to reclaim his political power in 1966 by launching the Cultural Revolution. He believed the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to rid the country of impure aspects and restore spirit. He shut down schools and led to the widespread formation of Red Guards, which consisted of students. They attacked Chinese elderly and intellectuals, and power struggles followed in many cities, causing Mao to send in troops. In the end, 1.5 million people were killed, and the Cultural Revolution would have a lasting impact on Chinese society.
Chiang Kai-shek, later known as Jiang Zhongzheng and Jiang Jieshi, was born on October 31, 1887 in Zhejiang province of Qing Dynasty, China. During his time at the Imperial Japanese Army, he returned to China for the Xinhai Revolution and joined the Chinese Revolutionary Party, which would later become the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party.
The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 forced Chiang to cooperate with Mao Zedong and the Communists. As China became under attack from Japan, US declared war on Japan in 1941. Placing China with the Allies during World War II. Chiang's reputation grew outside of China, particularly to the West and the US. But after World War II, he was losing support, and the Communists eventually defeated Chiang and the Nationalists in the 1949 Civil War. This forced him to flee to Taiwan, which was given to the Nationalist government under the Cairo Conference of 1943.
After the end of World War II and Japanese surrender, Chiang and the KMT called for Japan to postpone their surrender. Some people also claim that Chiang and the KMT had the Japanese help defeat the lingering communists. To evade a possible civil war, the US suspected tension growing and encouraged concessions. But the KMT's decreasing popularity eventually grew to a civil war. A new constitution was written in 1947, but the communists refused to recognize it. With the capital city falling in April 1949, Chiang was forced to resign in January of 1949 after his army suffered many defeats to the Communist Army. In December, Chiang fled to Taiwan.
The White Terror was the time period between 1949 and 1987, in which Chiang placed the island of Taiwan under martial law. During the White Terror, 140,000 people were imprisoned by the KMT government, with 3,000 to 4,000 people executed, mostly between 1950 and 1952. The government claimed many to be communist spies, officially labeled as bandit spies, and arrested them in fear of their resistance to the government.
After losing the civil war to Mao and the communists, Chiang relocated the government to Taipei in 1950. Throughout several terms of presidency, he attempted to claim and assert sovereignty over mainland China as well as territory. He created an army to protect the island from communist forces and allied with other ethnic groups associated with the nationalists. In 1965, he planned Project National Glory, a military operation that tried to retake mainland China but failed. Throughout the Cold War, Chiang's government would be recognized as the legitimate government of the Republic of China. Some of the most important events of the Cold War took place in Asia. It only makes sense that some of the most powerful Asian leaders in the region had an impact on the war. The United States constantly tried to keep many countries away from communism and to gain advantages as well. Chiang Kai-shek would be the Chinese leader who the US thought could align with them. Chiang would take a relatively active stance in getting involved with foreign powers, and Americans would view him as the official government of the Republic of China, and the most important anti-communist leader in Asia. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, was the communist leader that defeated the nationalists in 1949 and brought the country into a completely different direction. He would rebuild the country at a dangerous pace for Americans and officially come head-to-head with the Americans in times of conflict. One important example was China's crucial involvement in the Korean War that prevented a complete liberation and unification of the Democratic Korea.
Let me ask
They'll try to make it that way.
General, what about if the Soviet Union, Khrushchev announces tomorrow, which I think he will, that if we attack Cuba, that it's going to be nuclear war? And what's your judgment as to the chances they'll fire these things off if we invade Cuba?
I don't believe a bit.
You don't think they will? In other words, you would take that risk if the situation seemed desirable.
Then, of course, I'll say this. I'd want to keep my own people very alert.
Yeah. No, hang on tight.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot, General.